This program is brought to you by the Reeves Law Firm, www.reevesfirm.com.
In the know. Good evening, everyone. In the know. Tony Reeves, fire. Following the news in any way, shape, or form. No shortage of things to talk about. What does it mean? What will it bring? This is a reality we simply have to accept. Tony Reeves, fire. Tony Reeves. Let's go ahead and get started.
I know this is probably going to take a bit of you back, so I'm going to tell you in advance you may want to take a moment, get something to drink, and re-listen to this a few times, because I want to talk to you today about work, more importantly, you working, and the various times that it may impact your case as you're going through the Social Security disability process. Please forgive me if I talk fast at any point in time. I'm going to try to make sure I explain it to the best of my ability. I know you're going to probably have more questions, so as always, make sure you send me a message here on YouTube, and I'll try to address them to the best of my ability. Anytime that I talk to somebody about Social Security, I always focus on the definition. The definition is the inability to engage in any substantial gainful activity by reason of any medically determinable physical or mental impairment, which can be expected to result in death, or which has lasted or be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. If you look at the definition, it talks about the inability to perform substantial gainful activity. And that's where people sometimes get a little lost, because they hear that phrase and they're like, what the heck does that mean? We call it SGA. We're going to talk about that, but that's really how Social Security defines the work that you've done. So they don't necessarily just zoom in to how much money you make or zoom in to the number of hours you've worked. They look at whether or not the work you've performed was substantial and gainful for purposes of determining whether or not your condition keeps you from doing those things. Now, what you'll notice when you're applying, you may not realize this, but when you're applying for Social Security, there's 5 steps that Social Security has to go through. It's like a series of checks and balances or doors that you have to go through in order to be found disabled. At each step, if something occurs, it usually tells the Social Security Administration to either stop or go forward. So if the person is engaging in SGA, it's presumed that they are not disabled, so they stop. But if they're not performing SGA at the time, then they go to step 2. One of the things, we're not going to talk about the 5 steps today, but I want you to focus on the 3 areas where work comes into play with the Social Security process. The first step, which is step 1, substantial gainful activity. Step 4, when talking about your past relevant work. And then step 5, when it comes to talking about doing other work. Like I said, I'm not really going to go into a whole lot of detail about the process, but here are the areas where work becomes crucial. So let's talk about what actually is substantial gainful activity. Well, to be very honest, it's what Social Security looks at when they're determining whether or not you're quote-unquote working. They're looking at a variety of different things. They look at the nature of what you do, the hours worked, productivity, pay, and any other additional factors for determining whether or not that's SGA. That's why they don't say, are you working? They say, are you performing substantial gainful activity? And they don't want, and this is where it's really important, people, when you're discussing the work that you've done in the past, you want to be descriptive. What happens a lot of time is people just kind of just throw out, well, I picked up trash, or, I did this kind of construction work. You want to be as detailed as possible, because Social Security is trying to decide if that is work that either one you're currently doing at the time or that you've done in the past. Now, the other reason why SGA is very important is because it can either be full-time or part-time. Sometimes people get into this thought that if they only worked part-time or they're only working part-time, that doesn't count against them for purposes of Social Security. Social Security does not define your SGA as full-time or part-time. That's why they don't put that staple on there. They want to look at the totality of the work that you've performed in the past. Keep in mind, if you work for somebody as an employee, or you work for yourself. Those are two totally different scenarios. Typically, when you work, for yourself, you typically are wearing more hats. You have more responsibilities or other skills that you acquire, because when you're working for yourself, you're basically a company unto yourself, as opposed to being an employee for a company. So keep that in mind. Also, one of the things that they do look at, and it's true, they look at pay. And they have it broken down by non-blind individuals, blind individuals. But for non-blind individuals, they look at how much money you're making per month. If you're making at least $1,130 a month, you're presumed to be making SGA. I will always tell people, don't get fixated on that number, because I've had people who've come to me and say, oh, well, then I make $1,129, so I should be fine. The closer you get to that number, it is presumed that more than likely you can perform that amount. Okay, so you want to make sure you describe what you do in detail. Why is that important? Well, think about it. If you were working for your cousin and your job requirement is to do certain things, but your cousin is actually letting you do things less than what a normal employee of the same level would be permitted to do, that's important for Social Security to know. So if your cousin hired you to be a driver, and as a driver you would normally drive to and from different locations. But instead of having you be a driver, they're basically paying you to sit at the office and, write down when people come back in saying that they've driven. So even though they have you on the books as a driver, you're not actually doing work as a driver. I always stress to people, Social Security does not know these things if you don't tell them. So you want to be detailed about what were your specific duties. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't glaze over it. What was your specific duties? How many hours were you working? Were in terms of productivity, were you held to a productivity requirement? Meaning, did you have to do a certain number of things? If there was any problems doing things like that, did they cut you any slack? How much were you getting paid? And any other things about that job, so that the person that is reviewing this will know specifically what job requirements and what your duties were, so Social Security can determine if you were performing what we call substantial gainful activity. There is a reason Social Security wants to know about the work that you've done in the past, because the very fourth step of the process is really based on your limitations. Can you do anything that you used to do? If Social Security believes that even when, and this is where it's really important, it's not going back to the same employer. Listen carefully now. It's not going back to the same employer. It's whether or not you have the ability to do the last jobs you had the last 15 years. Because sometimes what happens is people get in their minds, oh, well, my employer wouldn't let me, deal with this situation because of all the problems that I was having. They would know way they would let me do the job. Okay, that employer you have might not. But the key is, and this is where vocational experts are really important, the key is whether or not your limitations will prevent you from doing specific jobs that you used to do in the last 15 years. Now, here's another thing that catches people off guard as well. Let's say you stopped working 2 years ago, but during the disability process, you were, you got to make ends meet. You got to do what you got to do. And you get a part-time job, and you do it for a period of time. Social Security, especially when you get to the judges level, they have to determine, did you perform that job long enough to learn how to do it to where you've acquired skills from that job, and for them to consider whether or not that job would be considered past relevant work. So I always stress to people, hey, if you go back to work, is that going to kill your case? Not necessarily, but it is something that Social Security must take in consideration for purposes of past work, and determining whether or not Social Security thinks that's a job you could do based on your limitations. I know there's going to be some of you out there that are probably trying to figure out, what do you mean by residual functional capacity? Think of it like this. There is the pre-disabled you and then the post-disabled you. Think about it from the time you became disabled to the present. What can you do now? What can you do despite the problems you have from pain, from problems you may have from physical limitations, from mental limitations? What are you able to do? And with those limitations, what jobs are you able to do with those limitations? This is why it's very important to have your doctors assist you with providing descriptions of the limitations of things you can and can't do. And as silly as it may seem, the more descriptive they are, the helpful it may be or more useful it can be to you, because it eliminates Social Security having to try to figure out what you can and you can't do. You want to make sure that you provide as many discussions of many limitations that you may possibly have, so that they can have an accurate and descriptive account of what your limitations are. So the residual functional capacity is the limitations of what you have based on your mental condition, physical conditions, and any other issues related to your health conditions. The final thing I wanted to talk to you about is about other work. And this is the part of the process that really gives people a lot of frustration, and they don't totally understand. Because most times people focus on the work that they used to do. They don't realize that the end all to be all is, does your condition prevent you from doing anything else? So as we talked about the residual functional capacity, once they've eliminated the work that you used to do, then what comes up is they look to see, with the limitation do you have, does it prevent you from doing anything else? I hate to say this, if Social Security has determined that with your limitations you can still do other work in significant numbers, under the regulations you are deemed to not be disabled. Okay? And this is the part that usually people have the hardest time overcoming. And I can't stress this enough. So I know I've talked about a few things today with regards to work. I hope this information is useful to you. Some of it may be a little confusing, so if as I've discussed this, there's some questions you want me to go into more detail about, or maybe you want me to focus more on one aspect of the discussion of work, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to address. Thank you for tuning in, and this is your Q&A Social Security Disability Today.